Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. We're so glad to have you listening in. We believe God has some powerful things to say today through this message. We believe that God wants to inspire you and motivate you, and He's got some real relevant things to say about what He wants to do in you and through you. And we've heard some great stories lately, and maybe you have a story about something God is doing in you, and we'd love to hear it. Log on to mystory.farhills.org and let us know what God is doing to change your life. Enjoy the message.
We all have questions. Questions like, why is it called a building if it's already built? Why is there no egg in eggplant? Wait, do penguins have knees? But some questions are more important than others. So we surveyed all of you to find your most asked questions. Questions like, how do I hear God's voice? How do I deal with difficult people? What does the Bible say about forgiveness? What will heaven be like? How do I cope with all of my stress? Every week, we're going to answer your most asked questions and discover God's best plan. Why? Because you asked for it.
Now, there we go. Look at that. I feel a little bit self-conscious right now because there was so many famous people in that list. Like Mr. T was on that list. I don't know if you guys were expecting Mr. T to come out, but I'm kind of the runner-up. He couldn't make it, and so I was kind of the one that was thrown up here. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Josh. I am the youth pastor here at Far Hills, and I'm super excited because number one, we have finally kicked off summer. Like last week, we had our big party, and we're finally in summer. Like that is amazing. I love this time of year. It's finally getting warm, and we get to experience the 3 months of warm weather that we get, and so I'm so excited about that. And we also, as the video said, we are kicking off a brand new sermon series called You Asked For It. Essentially, over the last few months, what has happened is that you guys have texted in questions to our staff in which we received just this big, massive slew of questions regarding theology and faith and Bible and living. And we've kind of disseminated them and took them apart and just try to answer them throughout these next couple weeks. Some of them are fun and quick, and some of them require a little bit of longer talking. And so we want to be able to spend just each week talking about 30 minutes on these subjects, on these conversations, and just digging in deep. And so this week, I have the honor of being able to talk about church and culture, if this works. There we go. Church and culture, there it is. Church and culture, and most specifically, the question that we had come in over the last couple of months was, how do we live in 21st century culture, American culture, as Christians? Like, how do we live within this world here right now, where we are at in Dayton, Ohio, in 2018 as Christians? And that is a big topic. Like every single one of us feel that the weight of that topic. Every single one of us that is relevant to. And to be honest, I am not wise enough, I am not smart enough, and I am not old enough to be able to really pick apart and give you the most effective answer. Like as I was prepping, I was not able to be like, well, out of all my years of wisdom and out of all my study of culture, I do not have just an unbelievable amount of knowledge on culture. And so as I was kind of studying, I have borrowed and I have begun to bring up different authors that have a lot of different knowledge on this subject. So there's a few good books. If you want to be able to seek out different resources at the end of this sermon, there's a new book that just came out by one of my favorite pastors named Matt Chandler. He has a book called Take Heart, in which he talks about taking courage in this culture that we're in. There's a book by David Platt that a friend gave me called Counterculture, in which he talks about living counter to the culture. Another one by Russell Moore called Onward, in which we kind of press forward politically in our society. And the biggest one, if you're not a book person and you'd rather watch a video, the biggest one that I've kind of borrowed is by Tim Keller. He's a former pastor, current author up in New York, and he talks about, he has a bunch of seminars on culture. And throughout all of these different topics, throughout all of these different authors, there was a common thread that I began to see as I was prepping this sermon. Every single one of them pointed out a certain tension that Christians here in this room, and maybe even the world, feels on a daily basis or as we are living our lives throughout the world. And it is called the sacred versus secular divide. The sacred versus secular divide. Essentially, what these people pointed out, what authors point out, is that there are two different cultures that we experience as Christians: the sacred and the secular. What we find in the sacred is typically our Christian culture. It is the world that we are living in, the world that we are sitting in right here, right now. It is the living out of what we would call the cultural mandate in Genesis 1:28. God makes the earth, he creates it, he plants it, and then he puts Adam and Eve in the garden, and he tells them to make families, make children, and to grow them into the Lord, to have dominion over everything. And he tells them to follow his laws, his rules, and to create societies based upon them. We see sacred culture marked by the taking of raw materials, the taking of different things around us, the taking of art, music, everything else, and using up to roll up into the worship of God and using it as God defines it. But we know that we don't live in this world today, right? Like there is something occurring that we don't use everything to the glory of God. We don't use everything how God defines it. And so what happens in Genesis 3, if you know the story, the world ends up fracturing, and we learn in Romans 1:25 that man no longer wants what God has to say about the world around us, but we want to do what we want to do. And so man decides to create their own culture. Man decides to build up and create what art, how we define it, music, how we define it, clothing, how we define it. And we see cultures constantly being built up upon no longer how God defines life, but how we define life. And there's a tension because Christ comes amongst a secular culture and gives us, through the death of his son, the ability to redeem the culture and bring it back into the sacred. We see him giving us the ability to enter into the secular culture, bringing sacred things, bringing our goodness into culture, bringing the good news of Christ into our world. And so the question is, how do we deal with this? How do we live in this? How do we bring the sacred into the secular in 21st century American culture? And an even bigger question than that is, what is 21st century American culture? Like, what is the world around us? I have a pleasure, because I am able to be the youth pastor here, because I'm constantly hanging out with young people, I'm getting more and more used to what the culture is around us. Like, part of my job, or at least maybe I gave myself this part of my job, part of my job is to kind of know what's happening in culture around us, and just kind of studying like what's going on so that I can be ahead of it. Because if you don't know, our culture moves at light speed. Like the phone that you have in your pocket right now is already outdated tomorrow, right? Like the things that you own, the car that you have is already outdated, and everything seems to fly by so fast. So I just try to stay ahead of it just so that I can know what's happening, right? And so here's a couple things. If you have been out of culture, maybe you don't know what's going on, some of you may recognize some of these things. Here are some markers of our society today. Entertainment, Netflix. Netflix has just absolutely taken over the entertainment industry. Almost every single person in this room has a Netflix account, right? Like every single one of us probably are watching a TV show, going to watch a TV show, or just ended watching a TV show. Like Netflix made binge watching possible, right? Like Netflix created a new addiction, right, to TV. Netflix created a new topic of conversation when you're at a party or mingling about, right? Like, what TV show are you watching? What are you going through right now? I don't have a TV show, I need one, right? Entertainment completely envelops our culture, and it's a big part of it. A second thing is sports. Right? Like sports is almost like a completely different religion within our culture. Like we paint ourselves up, we go to games, and when watch these figures, we almost are like celebrating. This is King James, if you guys don't know who he is. Today, like we are watching, if J.R. Smith doesn't end up ruining the playoffs for him, today we are watching the greatest basketball player of all time play. right? Like we are watching history unfold in front of our eyes in 21st century American culture, and sports kind of envelop what we do. This is a little bit of a different one, but because of free thought within our world, because of free ideas that kind of mark our culture, one of the newest ideas that have come about, and you may not know this, but it's the flat earth theory. Okay? There are actual groups of people. I don't know if there's anybody in this room right now. God loves you. There are people that actually believe the earth is flat, okay? And that we have been lied to by NASA and the government that it is round. All right, and so if you were to travel the world, you could walk off hypothetically, but NASA has created an ice wall that shrouds the entire earth so that you cannot fall off. They don't believe that satellites are real. They don't believe that gravity exists. They think that everything in our world is basically fake compared to what we actually think about it. But these ideas are kind of prevalent in our society. And here's an even weirder one. Consumerism and individualism also takes up our society. And the most blatant example today of this is a 9-year-old girl named Lil Tay. Okay. Now, I am not a proponent, and I am not condoning you to go look at her social media accounts. Okay. This is a warning. I am not pressing you to go and see those things. Parents, be careful about it. This is more of a warning to you as parents that this is a thing in our culture. Okay, Lil Tay is a 9-year-old who, quote unquote, flexes on people, flexes on you as individuals about how much money she has, how she went to Harvard. She'll constantly be around Lamborghinis, and she is coached by her son, or her brother, her son would be weird, her brother to basically just tell you how much money she has. And this is an example, like, because of consumerism, because of materialism, because of all the things in our culture, this has become an actual thing, believe it or not. Lil Tay has become a thing. Politics mark our society, right? Like politically, you cannot go a day without hearing something that is happening politically, right? Like our phones are constantly blowing up. I don't even know how to turn it off, but there is some sort of news notification that constantly makes me think I'm getting text messages over and over and over again on my phone. It's something about what the president's doing right, what the president's doing wrong. It's something about a war we're heading into. It's something about some sort of movement that's occurring. There's things all around us, and we'll typically align ourselves with whether or not we are left wing or right wing or in between or whatever it may be. We identify ourselves with politics, and I believe this is the last one. The last one is social media. Man, social media has become an absolutely unbelievably prevalent thing within our society. Like we are almost more obsessed with who we are on social media than who we are as people. Like social media has become something that is absolutely, completely, and utterly just filled our lives. And we're spending hours just on our phones trying to update who we are, trying to look at and send out pictures. We're trying to constantly use all these things. And on top of all of these different things, on top of social media, politically, on top of Lil Tay and everything else in between, man, we are just constantly flooded with tragedy in our culture. We're flooded with movements. We're flooded with problems, issues, natural disasters. Like Hawaii's still like under lava right now. There's all of these different things. People are just being wrecked by so many different things, school shootings and problems in our culture, in our lives. And I think a lot of times as Christians, we don't know how to respond to it. I mean, it's hard. We want to live out what God wants us to live out and not be like the culture, but at the same time, we're called to be in the culture. And so I think sometimes we have 3 different responses to it, and we find ourselves within these kind of 3 categories. Like the first category, we end up trying to fight the culture. I mean, we see Lil Tay being insane and crazy and it being really weird. And so we kind of garner ourselves up and we're like, man, we need to end this. We need to kind of get rid of this. Let's start a movement. Let's go try to pass legislation. Let's fight this thing and let's win the culture war, right? There's some good things about it, but there's also some bad things about it where we end up ruining souls in the process. There's another way is that we separate ourselves from the culture. We kind of see what's going on around us. We see flat earth theory. We see all these weird things that are happening. We're like, man, I got to get away from this. I got to push myself into the church. I got to get myself into my own realm. Like when I get home and I drive up my driveway, I got to make sure I open the garage door, get in my car, and then let the garage door shut behind me so I don't talk to anybody, right? Like we don't want to interact with anyone weird. We don't want to interact with anybody that has different beliefs than us. I mean, we want to shut ourselves up and live in a very specific type of place. And the last one is relevance. It's relevance. I think sometimes we see the culture around us, and man, we want to maybe evangelize to them. Maybe we don't even want to evangelize to them. We want to just be like them because we see the things that they have, and we want to be able to enter into the secular world, and so we become like them. We listen to the music that they listen to. We listen to we watch the movies that they do. We do all the same things, and the problem is every single one of these responses fight against what the Lord has called us to. Fight against what the Bible is constantly pleading to us. And so this morning, I want us to find a better way. This morning, I want us to find a way in which Christ calls us to not live out these three things, but to do something different and to actually enter into the culture to help redeem and bring back life into it, to bring back life into 21st century America. And so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up to Romans chapter 12, verse 9 through 21. I don't have it on the screen here, but I'm going to read it. Paul, the Apostle Paul, is writing a letter to a church in Rome. He's essentially instructing the church and giving them what are called imperatives or different commands in order to be able to live within the culture that they're living in and live within the church that they're living in. And so I just want us to sit underneath some of these imperatives, and then we're going to go through them a little bit. It says in verse 9, "Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil and hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not be slothful in zeal, but be fervent in the Spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality." Verse 14 says, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all." Verse 19 says, "Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." If there's one summary of how what I believe Paul is putting forward to us, if what I believe authors and theologians believe Paul is putting forward to us, it would be something like this. That as Christians, we respond to the culture around us by faithful service within it. We respond to the culture not by fighting, not by separating ourselves, not by becoming relevant to it, but by faithfully serving inside of it. By faithfully. So I want to break down what this looks like. And I want to kind of talk about each one of these words, faithful servant within. Number one, what we see in this text, it says that we are to be faithful within the culture. Faithful within the culture. In verse 9, it says, let's see if I have it here. It says, "Let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good." To abhor what is evil and to hold fast what is good. Paul is pressing into the Romans and into us to hate certain things and to love what is good. He pushes us to have a certain amount of private devotion and private conviction within our lives to a certain amount of morality and love for Christ within our world. That we remain faithful not to what the world has to say, but what to God has to say. So that means that we end up hating murder and abuse, and we end up clinging onto justice. Man, we hate we hate racism, and we cling to racial equality. And we hate the misuse of sexuality, and we cling to God's design of it. We hate self-promotion, and we cling to selfishness. We hate condemnation, and we cling to grace within our culture. And we love what is good. We remain faithful and steadfast despite the world that is going on to us around us, and we love what God has given us. We love his rules, his laws and designs, and that means that we are not subservient to the culture around us, the way they talk, the way they dress, but we are subservient to what Christ has called us to be, his laws, his goodness, and his authority. We cling on to him. and what he has to say. Now, what Paul isn't saying in this text is he's not telling us to hate the form of what we receive, but the content of it. There's a difference. He's not saying, hey, hate your iPhone, right? He's not telling us, hey, hate your TV. I'm not a proponent. I don't believe that you need to throw out your TV out of your house, right? Like, I don't think that you need to go get a hammer. I don't think you need to go get a bat and try to bash in every computer around your house just because it's the most relevant thing in society. But he's telling us to watch the content on it. He is telling us to shun the evil things that may be on it, things that kind of stir in our hearts, things that may lead us away from the Lord and push us away from Christ. And why would Paul tell us this? It's because Paul knows that the things of culture around us can so easily impact our souls, our hearts, and our mind. That we are easily influenced by, we are easily discipled by, we are easily changed by the things that we consume in our life. And he tells us to remain steadfast. And the problem is this opposes relevance in our life, right? Like us having to say no to certain content, us having to say no to certain things, us having to walk away and say, I'm not going to watch this because of the content that's within it. I'm not going to rest upon explicit things, makes us stand out because the world does not have that sort of filter. Like generally, the world will not end up having that amount of pushback, and we end up standing out and looking different because we have to say no. And we have to rest in that. We need to take up courage in the fact that we are trying to be faithful in who Christ is, and that's okay because we need to rest in the fact that the world will be changed and redeemed not by how relevant we are, but by the good news of who Christ is. That people will be changed by the death of Christ on the cross, and they will see your faithfulness and they will see something different. That no one was ever saved because we ended up tweeting out woke, or that we were binge watching Westworld, or we know all the Drake lyrics that ever existed. No one ever was saved by those things. No one was ever saved because Jesus was made cool enough. They were saved by a certain revelation. They were saved by an unbelievable love and devotion. They were saved by a faithfulness to who Christ is. It absolutely opposes relevance. And the question is, do we stand out? Do we stand out as faithful and true amongst the culture that we are in? We must remain faithful. We must hate what is evil, cling to what is good amongst our culture. The second thing that I believe is not only do we need to be faithful within the culture, we need to serve within the culture. We need to serve within the culture. When I was younger, my family went to a Baptist church around here, and at that church, this is a little bit antiquated, maybe some churches still have it, but there was a library at this church, and at the library, my dad would always get different movies on VCR, and so we would watch cassette tapes, and he would get a bunch of different kinds of movies, kind of all around, and one of the favorite genres that my family would watch and kind of constantly delve into was basically like end time movies, like Revelation end time movies. Like, if you ever heard of Left Behind with Kirk Cameron, I'm completely and utterly maybe like showing like a Christian culture that I've grown up in, but that Left Behind with Kirk Cameron, not with Nick Cage. There's a certain type of culture, there's a certain type of like video genre of Christian rapture movies. And one of them was called A Thief in the Night. And essentially what it was a Christian horror film to scare you about when Jesus came back and took you away. And it was based in the 1970s. And so it was like, you can go and actually look up the trailer online. It was the scariest thing in the entire world. Like, every single moment of my life, if my parents were gone out of the house, man, I thought Jesus came back and raptured them and I was about to be led away by the Antichrist. Like, every single moment of my life, I was afraid. This movie freaked me out. Like, there was guillotines and there was people, like there was like these big monsters always around. I didn't even know what was happening at all whatsoever. It was just freaky, like constantly scared. But in this movie, in this weird movie, there was this one very specific scene that stuck out to me. I don't know why it ended up sticking out to me or why it's kind of like it's been so ebbed into my mind. But there was this one scene where all these Christians are running away from basically like the one world government, and they go into like this cave. And they're all kind of sitting around the cave, and they decided to start singing these hymns. And there was a certain song that they end up start singing, and it was a song that said something like, "They will know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They will know we are Christians by our love." And for whatever reason, that moment, like that moment in the movie, I sang that song growing up. I saw that in the movie. That stuck out to me. Like that followed me around. Because every once in a while, I knew that I wasn't showing the love and devotion to Christ. And I think it hit the nail on the head. That song absolutely hit the nail on the head, that this culture around us will not be impressed by our theological knowledge, our ability to reason, our philosophical understanding, unless we practice it. Man, we need to love and know the gospel that we actually believe in. We need to show it. The gospel is always made visible. Love of Christ is always made visible. And if it is not, then it is most likely dead, according to James 1. I mean, our faith needs to be shown to the world around us, and it is shown by our love and our service of them, of those around us, of the culture around us. Paul says in verse 10 through 13, he says a bunch of different things about us serving and loving the culture around us. He says, love one another, outdo one another, do not be slothful, be fervent, serve the Lord, contribute, show hospitality. He constantly pushes us to make love visible, to show the culture around them that we care, to show them that the gospel we believe in is actually relevant and true and is infected and impacted our lives to the point where we serve them. Christ calls us not to enter into our culture as conquering kings, but as fearless servants who serve. If we want to gain influence, if we want to begin to gain back power, if we want to actually begin to be relevant to the culture in terms to be able to share the gospel, we do so by serving. Not by ruling with an iron fist, not by trying to garner up the ladder of political status, but by serving those around us. Tim Keller said it this way. There we go. Okay, it says this: if you seek power rather than service, you will never get power, nor will you serve. But if you seek service rather than power, people will give you the power. He's absolutely right. I mean, if we want to be able to actually gain influence in this culture to radically change their lives and impact them with the gospel, we don't just immediately insert ourselves in their lives and just believe that we are the ones that are going to take over and show them the right way. We enter into their lives by serving them, caring for them, loving them, giving beyond our means, going to the hard parts of the city to show care and mercy and love. Going to those who are addicted and helping them out of their addiction, showing them a grace, showing them a redeeming love, loving the difficult, going into dangerous parts of our cities and our world, and showing people care. And I think sometimes we end up missing this in our lives because we can become so absolutely filled with what's going on currently. We can become so absolutely filled with the things and the tasks, the menial things that are in our lives, and we get so stuck on them. But the Lord constantly, Paul presses us constantly to serve those around us, to love, to care, to show that the gospel is active within our life. And the way that we can kind of take a temperature, kind of begin to actually see if we are doing this is by asking ourselves this question: if you were to be removed from the community around you, would anybody notice? I mean, if you were in your neighborhood, if you were to move, what would people say? And would people say good things? Would they say bad things? Would people say that there's a vacuum of love and care and tenderness from this neighborhood because of this person is no longer there? And think about it, if you were removed from your workplace, and would someone say something, man, would they see and feel a difference? If Far Hills Church were to remove ourselves from the city of Centerville, would nonprofits even notice? I mean, would the world around us even notice? Would downtown Dayton notice? Would Centerville notice? Would we begin to see it? And if we cannot answer that question correctly, if we cannot answer that question with an emphatic yes, then we need to be serving more, to reach out to the lowly and to help those in need, to show hospitality not only to each other, but to those outside our walls. We don't fight the culture. We are fearless servants to it. We're fearless servants to it. The last thing, number 3, says this. There we go. We live within the culture. We live within the culture. At the very, very end here, in verses 14 through 18, Paul presses us to know specific types of people. He says to bless those who persecute you. He says to rejoice with those who rejoice. He says to love the lowly. He says to weep with those who weep. So there's a bunch of different people that Paul is talking about, types of people that are within our lives on a daily basis. He talks about how there are rejoicers, right? Like people that are celebrating things that are happening in their lives, people that have been promoted to a certain place, people that are winning in life, things that are happening that are good, things that are great that are occurring in their lives. There's also those who are weepers, those who have experienced tragedy and loss. Maybe they've been impacted by a school shooting, or they've been impacted by a death of a loved one. Maybe they've been impacted by something that's culturally going around us and they're experiencing significant loss. Maybe there's the lowly, those around us in our culture and society who are addicted, who are homeless, who are struggling, who are absolutely and completely decimated from life. And then there's the persecutors, those who put us down, those who are constantly maybe making fun of us. Maybe they're taking shots at us on social media. Maybe they're doing different things in our life. And it's interesting to me because there are a lot of these people that are in the church, but most of these people are not inside these walls, they're outside. Most of the rejoicers are outside. Most of the weepers are outside. Most of the lowly are outside our walls. And Paul calls us to interact with them and to do 2 things. Number 1, have proximity to them. Like we're actually able to know why they're rejoicing. We're actually able to know why they're weeping. Like we are in an active relationship with them, getting to know what's happening in their life. We are not removed. We are not completely and utterly watching their life from a distance. We are actively in a relationship with them. And then he also not only calls us to proximity, he calls us to empathize, right? And that is a lost art in 21st century America. I mean, he calls us to know why they are weeping. Man, you cannot start weeping with someone if you don't know why they're crying. I mean, you can't rejoice with someone if you don't know what they're happy about. He calls us to feel the same emotions that are stirring within their heart and their life and be so close to them that we feel the pain of what's going on within them. So this means that we do not separate our sacred life and the secular life. We do not separate our work from our faith. We don't separate our friends from our faith. We integrate them. We bring them all together. The best way that we can begin to live out our faith and live within the culture, to empathize and have proximity to other people, is by using our jobs to be able to impact those around us. To use our workforce, to use our workplace, to use art, music, culture, to impact those around us. We don't separate ourselves away from the culture. We are actively engaging with them while remaining faithful, which means we don't just need Christian music. It's good, but we need Christians in music. We don't just need Christian art. We need Christians in art. We don't just need Christians in work. We need Christians in the workforce. We need to be actively engaging in our society, our work around us, and we need to be living with those around us if we are looking to redeem and reconcile those who surround us in our culture. We need to be faithfully serving within our culture. So as I wrap up, as I begin to conclude, I just want to share a fun little thing my family does. We like to do this thing where when we have like a meal together, we're kind of hanging out on a weekend night. We have this thing called table topics. That we kind of like get out. I don't know if you guys have ever seen them before, but basically on Amazon, you can buy these little like boxes that have different conversations when the conversation's like lulling, or maybe like you have a family member that you want to kind of get out of a certain conversation with, right? We kind of pick different conversation and topics out. And one of the questions that's kind of stuck with me, and one of the ones that I like a lot as we've conversed is, it says, if you could live in any time period, within the history of the United States, which time period would you live in? And I think that conversation, that like topic's really interesting because I think back on like my own life, I'm like, man, how cool would it be to be in 1776, to be able to see like the rise of America and see what's happening, and maybe I could made some sort of impact or done something within it and be able to see how the Lord was moving and working. And maybe in 1945 when Europe was liberated and we ended up seeing the end of World War II, and we were able to celebrate the fact that we finally were able to see evil kind of decimated in some way. And I think back on all these different things, and I think it strikes a chord within my life and within our own hearts, because we believe there was maybe a time and a place that we were able to make an impact that is not now, right? Like we feel like right now in 21st century America, this world is too weird, it's too strange, we don't know how to relate to it, we don't know how to live within it. So maybe there was a time, there was a place that we could have lived to be able to make an actual impact. And let me just encourage you. Man, you have been planted here by God in this time period and this place by no mistake. He has put you in the city of Dayton in 21st century America to help redeem and bring the sacred into the secular, to be able to bring back those around us. He is inviting us in to be able to join in on the work that he is doing today. And we can either punt on that responsibility. We can either fight, we can separate, we can try to become relevant, but he is asking us to enter into where you are right now, at the job you're at the house you're in the place that you are sitting, in the city that you're in, to do an active work today. And he did not make a mistake. Man, he placed you here right now, and if he wanted someone else, he would have put someone else. Go and do the work of faithfully serving within the culture. Let me pray for us, and then we can head out. Lord, I thank you for just the fact that we can spend this time this morning all together. And I pray, Lord, that as we begin to talk about this, as we read Romans 12, and we see the way that Paul convicts us and charges us to be a people that are actively, faithfully serving within our culture, I pray that you just stir within our hearts and convict us and move us where we may be struggling in that place, in that area. Lord, help us to love those who are lowly, to love those who are weeping, and to mourn with them and to rejoice with them. Lord, we pray all these things. In your name I pray. Amen.